Welcome to War Archives Black. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed and leave a like to stay inside the operation.
Put on your boots, grab your hat, march along, imagine that. Tiny hands, big salute, little soldiers looking cute. Step in line, the future's bright. Left, right, left, we'll win the fight. Dreams are big, you're small but true. America's counting on you.
In the spring of 1936, a boy named Wilhelm sat in a darkened theater in Munich, watching shadows dance across a screen. He was 7 years old, and the images before him were unlike anything he had ever seen. Mountains glowing in morning light, flags rippling in slow motion, thousands of faces turned upward toward a single voice. The music swelled, horns and drums building to a rhythm that matched his heartbeat, and when the crowd on screen began to cheer, Wilhelm felt his own throat tighten with emotion he couldn't name. He didn't understand why tears were forming in his eyes, why his small hands were clenched in his lap, why he suddenly felt both insignificant and part of something vast and eternal. This was his fourth time watching the film. His teacher had brought the entire class, and they would return 6 more times before the year ended. Wilhelm couldn't have known, sitting there in the flicker of projected light, that what he was experiencing wasn't spontaneous emotion but the result of carefully calculated psychological manipulation, that every cut, every angle, every musical cue had been engineered by a team of filmmakers working under direct orders from the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. He couldn't have known that millions of children across Germany were sitting in similar theaters at that exact moment, all of them absorbing the same carefully constructed message, all of them being shaped by images designed not to inform or entertain but to transform the way they understood loyalty, sacrifice, and death. And he certainly couldn't have known that 12 years later, at 19 years old, he would die in the frozen mud outside Stalingrad, still carrying in his mind the echo of those drums, still believing in the glory that flickered across a screen when he was 7. This is the story of the screen that raised soldiers, the invisible hand that reached into childhood and planted seeds that would bloom into obedience, violence, and willing self-destruction. This is the story of how nations discovered they didn't need to force children to fight, they only needed to teach them to want to. The history of using media to condition young minds for war didn't begin with cinema, but cinema perfected it in ways no pamphlet or speech ever could. Before the 20th century, the preparation of children for military service was crude and direct. Toy soldiers, martial songs, stories of heroes dying gloriously for king or country. These methods worked, but they were limited by imagination, by the child's ability to visualize what glory looked like, what sacrifice sounded like, what dying for something greater than yourself actually meant. The printed word could describe, the schoolteacher could explain, but both required the child to actively construct the image in their own mind, and in that construction there was always room for doubt, for the imagination to wander toward uncomfortable questions. Then came the moving image and everything changed. For the first time in human history, children could be shown exactly what to feel, exactly when to feel it, with no room for their imagination to introduce doubt or hesitation. The film didn't ask them to picture a heroic soldier. It placed one directly before their eyes, larger than life, perfect in every detail. The film didn't suggest what courage looked like. It demonstrated it in high contrast black and white, underscored by music that told the nervous system how to respond before the conscious mind could interfere. This was not persuasion in the traditional sense. This was something far more powerful and far more dangerous. This was the implantation of emotional memory, the creation of feelings that would later be mistaken for authentic personal conviction. Germany understood this earlier and more completely than any other nation, though they were far from alone in their exploitation of the technique. In the years following World War I, German military and political leaders had watched their country tear itself apart, had seen soldiers return home broken and disillusioned, had witnessed the total collapse of the romantic narratives about war that had sent millions marching to their deaths. They understood that the next war, and they were already planning the next war, would require a population that had never experienced the reality of modern combat, a population young enough to be convinced that what happened between 1914 and 1918 was not the truth of war but an aberration, a temporary setback on the path to inevitable glory. They needed children who had no memory of the trenches, no uncle who drank himself to sleep every night trying to forget what he'd seen at Verdun, no older brother who came home missing 3 limbs and the ability to look anyone in the eye. What they needed was a generation raised entirely on images they controlled, and the technology to create those images had just become available. The UFA film studios, the Nazi Party's control over educational content, the Hitler Youth programs with their coordinated use of visual propaganda, All of these were pieces of a larger machine designed to reach into the developing brain of every German child and install a set of beliefs so fundamental, so emotionally rooted, that they would feel like personal truth rather than external indoctrination. The goal was not to teach children facts about history or politics that they might later question, but to associate certain images with certain emotions so deeply that the connection would bypass rational thought entirely. Let me describe how this worked in practice, because the technique was far more sophisticated than most people realize, even now, even knowing what we know about propaganda and psychological manipulation. When Wilhelm and his classmates sat in that theater in Munich, they weren't just watching a documentary about a political rally. They were undergoing a carefully designed emotional conditioning process that had been refined through extensive testing and psychological consultation. The filmmakers had studied the work of Soviet montage theorists, they had consulted with advertising psychologists, they had even incorporated research from Pavlov's experiments on classical conditioning. What they created was a form of cinema that functioned less like entertainment or information and more like a systematic program for emotional manipulation. The film would begin with images of chaos, Weimar-era street fighting, unemployment lines, hungry children, weak and corrupt politicians arguing while the nation suffered. These images were shown in harsh, unflattering light, with discordant music and quick, jagged cuts that created a sense of anxiety and disorder. The child watching would feel uncomfortable, tense, vaguely frightened, though they wouldn't necessarily understand why. Their nervous system was being primed, their baseline emotional state deliberately destabilized so that what came next would feel like relief, like salvation, like the answer to a question they hadn't known they were asking. Then, at the moment of maximum discomfort, the film would cut to order. Ranks of young men in perfect formation, flags that seemed to glow with inner light, architecture that spoke of permanence and power. The music would shift to something grand and stirring, the camera would slow down, allowing each image to breathe and settle into the viewer's consciousness. The child's nervous system, still tense from the previous sequence, would flood with relief and something like joy. They weren't being told that order was better than chaos. They were being made to feel it in their body, in the relaxation of muscles they hadn't realized were clenched, in the sudden ease of their breathing. This wasn't intellectual persuasion. This was the installation of an automatic emotional response that would trigger every time they encountered similar imagery for the rest of their lives. But the process went deeper still. Interspersed throughout the film were images of children like Wilhelm himself. Young faces shining with devotion, small hands raised in salute, voices joined in songs about sacrifice and loyalty. This was perhaps the most insidious element of the entire technique because it gave the child viewer a mirror, a model of who they were supposed to be. When Wilhelm saw other 7-year-olds on screen looking proud and purposeful, their eyes fixed on something beyond the camera with absolute certainty, his own mind would automatically begin to simulate that emotional state. Mirror neurons in his developing brain would fire as if he himself were experiencing that pride, that certainty, that sense of belonging to something vast and important. By the time the film ended and the lights came up, Wilhelm would have practiced dozens of times the feeling of being a faithful soldier, even though he'd never held a weapon or heard a shot fired in anger. The repetition was crucial. One viewing might plant a seed, but the technique required constant reinforcement, the same images and associations repeated until they became inseparable from the child's sense of identity. Wilhelm's class returned to the theater again and again, yes, but the conditioning continued everywhere. In textbooks illustrated with heroic imagery, in classroom decorations showing maps of territorial expansion, in songs taught during music lessons that paired innocent melodies with lyrics about blood and soil. Every subject, every lesson, every moment of a child's educational experience was threaded with the same fundamental message. You exist to serve, sacrifice is the highest virtue, death in service to the nation is not tragedy but triumph. The Hitler Youth programs took this even further by adding physical experience to the visual conditioning. After spending hours absorbing images of martial glory, children would then be taken to camps where they could act out what they'd seen on screen. Marching in formation, participating in mock battles, learning to subordinate individual desire to group cohesion. The images gave them the emotional framework. The physical activities gave them the muscle memory and social reinforcement. By the time a boy like Wilhelm reached adolescence, the connection between personal identity and military service wasn't something he believed intellectually, it was something he felt in his bones, in his autonomic nervous system, in reflexes that had been carefully installed over thousands of hours of coordinated conditioning. But Germany was not alone in understanding and exploiting these techniques, though they may have pursued them with the most systematic intensity. During the same period, similar programs were being developed in the Soviet Union, in fascist Italy, in militaristic Japan. Each nation had its own cultural specificity, its own symbols and narratives, but the underlying psychological technique was remarkably consistent across borders and ideologies. They had all discovered the same fundamental truth. If you can control what a child sees during their formative years, if you can associate certain images with certain emotions before critical thinking develops, you can create adults who will march toward death believing they are fulfilling their deepest authentic desire. In the Soviet Union, the emphasis was on cinema as a tool for creating the new Soviet man, a human being liberated from bourgeois individualism and fully devoted to the collective. Soviet filmmakers, many of them genuine artists who believed in the revolutionary project, created works of stunning visual power that associated communism with modernity, progress, and the heroic struggle against oppression. Children watched films where tractors gleamed like sacred objects, where factory workers moved in choreographed unison like a living machine, where the individual hero was always subsumed into the collective triumph. The message was different from the Nazi emphasis on racial destiny, but the technique was identical. Use cinema to install emotional associations that bypass conscious reasoning. The Soviet approach included an innovation that other nations would later adopt: the use of animation for political conditioning. Animators discovered that cartoon characters could be even more effective than live-action actors at shaping young minds, because animated figures existed in a space of pure symbol and emotion, unencumbered by the messy reality of actual human bodies. A cartoon soldier could be simultaneously adorable and fierce, could die and bounce back to life, could demonstrate courage without the viewer having to confront what real bullets do to real flesh. Children who had been carefully shielded from images of actual battlefield carnage could watch animated depictions of war that made violence seem clean, simple, and consequence-free. By the time they were old enough to understand that real war was different, the emotional associations had already been formed, and the rational recognition that cartoon violence wasn't realistic did nothing to dislodge the feelings that had been installed. Japan's approach combined traditional cultural narratives about honor and sacrifice with cutting-edge media manipulation. Japanese children were raised on stories of the 47 Ronin, of samurai who chose death over dishonor, of warriors who found spiritual transcendence through absolute loyalty. These stories had existed for centuries, but in the 1930s they were adapted into films, radio dramas, and educational materials that connected ancient Bushido philosophy to contemporary military objectives. A child watching a film about historical samurai would see their struggle framed in terms that made Japanese territorial expansion in China seem like a continuation of an eternal cultural mission. The past was used to colonize the future, and the medium of cinema collapsed the distance between them, making 7th-century warriors and 20th-century soldiers seem like participants in a single continuous story. The Japanese system also made extensive use of what we might now call immersive media environments. Schools were decorated with murals showing military victories, radio broadcasts mixed entertainment with martial messages, even children's games were designed to normalize military imagery and violent play. A child's entire sensory environment was curated to reinforce a single message: your life finds meaning through service and sacrifice, and the highest form of existence is to die for the emperor. By the time Japanese adolescents were old enough to volunteer for kamikaze missions, they weren't being asked to overcome a natural fear of death. They were being offered the opportunity to finally fulfill the purpose that every image, every story, every lesson of their entire lives had promised them. What made these techniques so powerful and so disturbing was that they didn't feel like coercion to the children experiencing them. The images, the music, the narratives, all of it felt like discovery, like the revelation of deep truths about the world and their place in it. Wilhelm didn't think he was being manipulated when he watched those films in Munich. He thought he was learning what it meant to be brave, to be part of something important, to be a man. The emotions he felt seemed to come from within himself, seemed to be his own authentic response to the nobility and beauty he saw on screen. He had no way of knowing that those feelings had been deliberately engineered, that the beauty he was responding to had been constructed specifically to trigger certain neurological responses, that what felt like personal conviction was actually the result of thousands of hours of carefully calibrated stimulus and response. This is perhaps the darkest truth about using media to condition children for war. The victims never recognize themselves as victims. They feel empowered, enlightened, part of an elite group that understands truths that others are too weak or too corrupted to accept. When Wilhelm eventually volunteered for military service at 17, a full year before he was required to register, he didn't feel like he was submitting to external pressure. He felt like he was finally becoming who he truly was, fulfilling a destiny that had been calling to him for as long as he could remember. The screen hadn't forced him to become a soldier, it had taught him to want nothing else. After World War II, when the full horror of these techniques became visible, there was a brief moment when it seemed like the world might collectively recoil from the use of media for psychological conditioning of children. The Nuremberg trials included testimony about Nazi propaganda methods, and for a few years, there was serious international discussion about regulating the use of emotional manipulation in educational and entertainment media. But that moment passed quickly, and what replaced it was not a rejection of the techniques but a more subtle and sophisticated deployment of them. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union continued to use cinema, television, and eventually video games to prepare children for potential military service, but they did so in ways that were less overtly militaristic, more deeply embedded in entertainment culture. American children grew up watching films and television shows where the heroes were always military men, where violence was the solution to complex problems, where sacrifice for the nation was portrayed as the highest form of virtue. These weren't crude propaganda films like the ones shown in Nazi Germany, they were big-budget Hollywood productions with compelling characters and sophisticated storytelling. But the underlying message was the same: your identity finds its fullest expression through service and sacrifice, and death in defense of national interests is noble rather than tragic. The genius of the American approach was that it distributed the conditioning across so many different types of media that no single piece felt like propaganda. A child might watch a war film on Friday, play with military-themed toys on Saturday, read a comic book about soldier heroes on Sunday, and see news coverage that framed every international conflict in terms of American heroism on Monday. No single exposure would seem like indoctrination, but the cumulative effect was a comprehensive shaping of how that child understood violence, masculinity, and national identity. By the time American boys reached draft age during Vietnam, they had absorbed thousands of hours of media showing them that real men served, that warriors were heroes, that questioning military authority was weakness or even treason. The Soviet approach was equally sophisticated but took a different form. Soviet children were raised on a steady diet of films, books, and programs that emphasized collective sacrifice for the motherland, that portrayed the Great Patriotic War as a defining moment of national identity, that made military service seem not like a political obligation but like participation in a continuous historical struggle against fascist darkness. The emotional associations being installed were similar to those used by the Nazis: the connection between personal identity and national destiny, the glorification of sacrifice, the framing of death and service as transcendent rather than tragic, but they were wrapped in a narrative of anti-fascist defense that made them seem morally unassailable. Both superpowers also pioneered the use of television as a tool for continuous conditioning. Unlike cinema, which required children to be brought to a specific location at a specific time, television entered the home and could shape young minds on a daily basis with minimal parental oversight. American and Soviet children alike spent hours each day absorbing imagery that normalized military values, that made weapons seem exciting rather than terrifying, that portrayed soldiers as the most admirable type of person. The repetition was constant and the medium was intimate. The glowing screen in the family living room became a trusted voice, almost a member of the household, and what it taught felt not like propaganda but like common sense, like the natural order of things. As media technology advanced, so did the sophistication of these conditioning techniques. Video games represented a quantum leap in effectiveness because they transformed children from passive viewers into active participants in military scenarios. A child playing a war-themed video game wasn't just watching images of combat. They were making decisions, experiencing consequences, learning to associate military objectives with the pleasure of achievement and the dopamine release of in-game rewards. The psychological impact was profound. Studies showed that children who spent significant time playing realistic military games developed decision-making patterns and emotional responses that closely mimicked actual military training. They were teaching themselves to be soldiers, believing they were simply playing. The game developers, many of whom had no conscious agenda beyond creating entertaining products, nevertheless incorporated the same psychological techniques that had been pioneered by propaganda filmmakers decades earlier. The association of military imagery with excitement and achievement, the glorification of violence as a problem-solving tool, the complete absence of realistic consequences for virtual killing, all of these elements functioned as a form of conditioning just as effective as anything shown in a Nazi theater or a Soviet youth camp. The difference was that it was voluntary, marketed as entertainment, and therefore completely invisible as a form of psychological manipulation. By the early 21st century, the line between entertainment and military recruitment had become almost entirely eroded. The United States military itself became a major player in the video game industry, funding the development of games like America's Army that were explicitly designed to make military service appealing to young people while simultaneously functioning as training tools. Children as young as 13 could download and play these games, spending hours learning the basics of military tactics, small unit coordination, and the mental framework of seeing the world through a targeting reticle. When they reached recruitment age, military service didn't feel foreign or frightening. It felt like a natural continuation of an activity they'd already mastered, an opportunity to finally do for real what they'd been practicing virtually for years. But perhaps the most disturbing evolution of these techniques has been their spread beyond authoritarian states and military powers into the general fabric of commercial media aimed at children. Corporations discovered that the same methods used to condition children to accept military service could be used to shape consumer behavior, political attitudes, and social values. The techniques of emotional manipulation through imagery, the use of repetition to install automatic responses, the association of products or ideas with carefully engineered feelings, all of these methods migrated from propaganda ministries into marketing departments, from military recruitment into commercial advertising. A child growing up in the contemporary media environment is subjected to thousands of hours of content designed to bypass their critical thinking and install specific emotional associations. They learn to connect certain brands with feelings of belonging and success, certain political positions with moral righteousness, certain lifestyle choices with personal fulfillment. The fact that much of this content isn't explicitly about military service or political ideology doesn't make it any less powerful as a conditioning tool. It simply means the child is being shaped in multiple directions simultaneously, their developing sense of identity colonized by whatever messages can most effectively penetrate their psychological defenses. And those defenses, we should understand, are minimal during childhood and adolescence. The human brain doesn't fully develop the capacity for critical analysis and impulse control until the mid-20s, which means that for the first quarter of their lives, human beings are exquisitely vulnerable to having their beliefs, values, and emotional responses shaped by external imagery. Every authoritarian regime, every military power, every corporation with something to sell has understood this vulnerability and exploited it to the maximum extent that technology and social norms allow. The screen that once raised soldiers now raises consumers, ideologues, and true believers of every variety, all of them convinced that their beliefs are their own, that their values emerged from authentic personal reflection rather than systematic manipulation. The children who sat in that theater with Wilhelm in 1936 couldn't have recognized what was being done to them, and neither can the children sitting in front of screens today. The technology has advanced, the content has become more sophisticated and less overtly militaristic, but the fundamental technique remains unchanged. Show a child certain images repeatedly during their formative years, associate those images with powerful emotions, and you can shape what kind of adult they become. Whether they grow up to march toward machine guns in Stalingrad or simply to accept without question whatever political narrative or consumer identity has been prepared for them, the mechanism is the same, the bypassing of conscious reasoning in favor of installed emotional responses that feel like personal truth. This is why the question of who controls the images children see is one of the most important political and ethical questions of any society. In authoritarian states, this control is explicit and centralized. The state determines what children will watch, what emotions will be associated with which images, what kind of citizens the next generation will become. In supposedly free societies, the control is distributed across various corporate and governmental entities, each pursuing their own agendas but collectively creating a media environment that shapes young minds just as comprehensively as any centralized propaganda ministry. The difference is primarily aesthetic. The effect is fundamentally the same. When Wilhelm died in the frozen mud outside Stalingrad, his last thoughts were not of bitterness or betrayal but of the images he'd carried with him since childhood. The glowing flags, the perfect formations, the faces of heroes who had sacrificed everything for something greater than themselves. He died believing he was fulfilling his destiny, that his death meant something, that he was part of a story that would be remembered and honored. The screen had taught him this, and he had never learned to question what the screen taught. In his final moments, as his body failed and the cold took him, he probably felt something like peace, the peace of a purpose fulfilled, a narrative completed. He couldn't have known that the story he believed he was part of was just another image projected on a screen, another carefully constructed fiction designed to make death acceptable to those too young to have learned that death is never acceptable, never glorious, never anything other than the end of everything that person might have been. The screen that raised Wilhelm raises soldiers still, though we rarely call them that anymore. It raises believers who will die for abstractions, consumers who will sacrifice their resources and well-being for brands and identities they've been taught to conflate with their authentic selves, political zealots willing to harm others in service of ideologies they absorbed before they were old enough to think critically about anything. The medium has evolved from cinema to television to streaming to virtual reality, but the technique remains constant because it exploits something fundamental about human neurodevelopment. The fact that our brains are designed to learn from and trust the patterns we're exposed to during childhood, that we're built to absorb the values and beliefs of our environment and mistake them for innate truth. Every parent who allows their child unlimited access to screens is conducting an experiment in psychological conditioning, though most don't think of it that way. They see entertainment, education, a convenient way to occupy a child's attention. What they don't see is the systematic installation of values, beliefs, and emotional associations that will shape their child's choices for decades to come. They don't recognize that every hour spent absorbing carefully crafted imagery is an hour spent learning who to be, what to want, what to believe, and what to die for. The fact that the content their child is watching probably wasn't created by a propaganda ministry doesn't make it any less effective as a conditioning tool. It only makes the conditioning harder to recognize and resist. If there's any hope for breaking this cycle, it lies in developing what we might call critical media literacy at the earliest possible age, teaching children not just to passively absorb images but to actively question who created those images, why they were created, what emotions they're designed to evoke, and what beliefs they're meant to install. This is extraordinarily difficult because it requires interrupting the conditioning process at the exact moment when the brain is most receptive to being shaped, most trusting of external authority, most eager to find patterns and meanings that will help make sense of a confusing world. It requires teaching children to doubt before they've fully learned how to believe, to question before they've developed the cognitive tools for systematic questioning. And even if we could successfully teach every child to approach media with skepticism and analytical distance, we'd still face the problem that emotional conditioning often bypasses conscious thought entirely. Wilhelm might have been taught to question propaganda, but when the music swelled and the flags rippled across the screen, his nervous system responded before his conscious mind could intervene. The associations between imagery and emotion were being formed at a level deeper than rational analysis, in the autonomic systems that govern fear and belonging and the desperate human need to be part of something larger than the isolated self. You can teach a child to think critically, but you cannot easily teach them to override the automatic responses that repeated imagery has installed in their nervous system. This is the true horror of what the screen has done and continues to do, not that it forces children to become soldiers or consumers or true believers, but that it teaches them to want to feel like they're discovering their authentic selves when they're actually performing a role that was written for them before they were born. The chains are invisible because they feel like freedom, the prison is unrecognizable because its walls are made of light and sound and the promise of meaning. Wilhelm marched to his death believing he was free, believing he had chosen his path, never understanding that the choice had been made for him in a darkened theater when he was 7 years old. And now, here, at the end of this account, we must sit with the uncomfortable question. What images are you carrying? What associations were installed in your mind before you were old enough to choose them? When you feel patriotic pride or brand loyalty or political certainty or the stirring of emotion at a particular piece of music or imagery, are you experiencing your authentic self or the echo of conditioning you received before you developed the tools to resist it? There's no easy answer, no simple way to separate the beliefs we've chosen from the beliefs that were chosen for us. The screen that raised soldiers raised all of us, though what it raised us to be may vary. We are, all of us, Wilhelm in that theater, watching images flicker in the dark, feeling emotions we think are our own. The screen is still glowing. The images are still carefully crafted. The children are still watching, learning, becoming who they were always meant to become. And somewhere, someone is counting on that, building their plans around the certainty that if you can control what a child sees, you can control what that child will die for. The war for the mind never ended. It only became invisible, transformed from crude propaganda into something so pervasive and sophisticated that we've learned to call it entertainment, education, culture. The screen still raises soldiers, we've just stopped calling them that. But when the time comes, when the call is made, they will march. They always have. They always will. Because they were taught to want to, and they'll never know the difference. If you've listened this far, you already know too much. The archive opens every week, revealing what was meant to stay hidden. Subscribe to War Archives Black. Remember, silence is control, and knowing changes nothing unless you choose to see. We'll be waiting in the dark with the next file.